All right, let me just, I'm gonna real quickly kind of review what we just did just for the sake of the recording. So I'm gonna share my screen. All right, so the what we're doing today is we're gonna kind of try to reverse engineer what looks to be a pretty complicated line of code, and that's right here. So you guys just went out into different groups to try and figure out to come up with an explanation for what it's doing, and now we're meeting back in. So would any groups like to volunteer to explain what's happening here?
We didn't quite get it all figured out, but kind of know what's going on.
Okay.
Um, I guess basically it's creating an array with three different arrays with five different integers that are all sorted from least to greatest. And this is a list comprehension, which is doing that. I guess the key lambda function is what's going in the three different arrays, the sorted numbers,
Okay.
and then range, which is taken from the range of five. It's like putting in like five random integers into an array, and then it's pushing it into a bigger array. And then it's
Okay.
creating three different arrays of five sorted integers.
Okay. Cool.
Uh,
Yeah, I think that's pretty good explanation. So another group. What's what's happening here?
So that's how Python does the functions that don't have names.
Okay. Yep.
And
So
then
it's
it's
often called
sorting.
anonymous functions. So you can do the same thing in JavaScript too, right? You don't use the lambda keyword, but um,
the fat arrow.
yes. So let me pull up a node here. So if I do something like, I don't know, what's this function anonymous? I can assign this, but so this is a function. So this is basically like a Python lambda. It's just I've just written a function. I don't give it a name. So this is a function that doesn't take any parameters and it returns the number 12. And I can assign it to a variable, so const, and I can call it. So this is called an anonymous function. Of course, the usual way in JavaScript is function my func, and then you do something like this, and then you do 12 in here. So I'm doing this on one line, so it's not very pretty, but um, probably the same thing. So in Python, you can do the same kind of thing. Why would you ever want to do something like this?
Is it for reusability?
Yeah, so it's a convenience. So it's actually what do you mean by reusability?
I was thinking, since like if you don't name the function, you could just, if you want something that's doing the same thing, you can just kind of use it again.
Okay, yeah, so if I have this, if I pull out this function right here, so how could I write this as a normal Python function that we're already familiar with?
For X in the length of string X. Or is it for X in the length of string X? Or for I or something like that?
So okay, so let's take a step back and someone describe this function. So when you talk about a function, there are two things that you need to care about. One, what does it take as input? And two, what does it return? So someone describe this function for me.
So it's a function that takes in x as a parameter and returns the length of x when it's been turned into a string.
Yes. So it takes in x. We don't really know what type that is. Could be in theory, it could be anything. What does it return? What type does it return?
Number.
Yes. So it returns an integer. So it takes something and it returns an integer. So now how could we rewrite this as a normal def function in Python?
Start with def,
Okay, def.
and you have to give it a name like find length.
Yes. Okay. So find len.
And column, right?
Colon.
No, perimeter.
Yep. Okay.
And then you put x in the perimeter.
All right.
Yeah. And go to next line, and you have to give it a variable name. So like maybe just length equals to len, and then yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
Return length next.
Return. Okay, so this works. Just to make this line up a little bit more closely, I'm gonna eliminate this extra step and just return that directly. So if we compare these two, there's a couple things you should notice. One is you have this keyword lambda. Then after the lambda, you have your parameters. And here we just have one, but if you have two, you would just do comma, whatever. So we have the parameter list after lambda. Excuse me. Then the colon. And then excuse me. And then notice that there's no explicit return here. So implicitly, whatever you put here is going to be returned. The restriction here is that this has to be on one line. So anything you do here has to be something you can do on one line. So if you want to do like a bunch of complicated if-else statements or something like that, then you can't do it in a lambda. So this has to be one line, and whatever you put here is going to be implicitly returned. So that's just like JavaScript, the JavaScript version of the anonymous function, where we don't explicitly say return 12 here, right? You just, whatever is on the other side of the arrow is implicitly going to be returned. So if we go back here, there's still a question of why is there, so how could we rewrite this to use this instead?
Can we do it as a callback function?
You could potentially, yeah. I mean, so that's definitely a thing that you could do. So you could call another function here, for example. But let's say I decide I don't want to use a lambda function. I just want to use a normal function. Is that possible? Could you do that here, or do you have to use a lambda? Let's go back to this example. So this is a function. It's anonymous. It's just kind of floating out there. So I want to assign it to a name so that I can refer to it later, so I can use it later. So I'm going to call this find len. I'll comment this out for now. If I want to call, well, let's do the other one first. If I want to call find len, how do I do that?
I do find len in parentheses with x.
Yep. I'll say, and then I can run this. And it prints out 3. So that's what I expect. What about the lambda version? Turns out it's the exact same. So this and this, these are exactly the same. They're just slightly different ways of doing the same thing. So if we go back here, how could we avoid using a lambda here?
We just call the function in it. Find length function.
Sorry, you're breaking up there.
You should be able to just call the regular function inside right after the key.
Okay. So what do you
Yeah.
mean by call the function?
Right after key equals, you should be able to find underscore length and then parentheses with x. And if it's above the list comprehension, it should work.
Okay. So let me try running this. So got a problem here. So the error is not so easy to read, but it's telling me that I've got a type error. So an int object is not callable. So if you get an error like something is not callable, so what kinds of things are callable?
The things that have return.
Yeah. So functions. So functions are callable. So Python at some point is trying to call a function, but it's actually getting an int. So it's trying to call an int as though it were a function. So what type of thing does this return?
Integer.
It returns an integer. So what's the problem with this?
But even though it's an integer, isn't that still a function? Find len, isn't that still a function? So why is it not callable?
Okay, so here's a question. So if I assign this x equals lambda, I'm going to comment this out for now. And if I do move this down. So what is y going to be?
Or y is going to be an integer because it's
Yeah.
already Call the function.
Yes, exactly. So y here is going to be an integer. What kind of thing is x going to be?
It's going to be like an object, so a reference to where that is in like memory.
Okay, good. So an object, what kind of object? So we can figure this out in
String.
Python by we can print the type of x. So if I run this,
It's a string. Oh, it's a function.
it's a function. So this is a function. This lambda right here is a function. Whereas this is an integer. So why is this an integer and this is a function?
Because of the length.
No, not exactly.
The function is returning something. And I'm sorry, right? The find length is returning an integer. And this here, well, I forgot what you said earlier, but it doesn't have any particular, it's not being called on anything, right? Like
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
this is not being this is being called. We are calling a function, and when you call a function, you get a return value. So right here, we are calling a function. We are calling find len, which means that find len, this return value is going to get evaluated, and the key is going to be whatever that integer is. Whereas before, we had this in there. This is not being called. It's just the function itself. It's a reference to the function itself. It's not being called. We're letting Python call it. We're letting this sorted method call it. We're just giving it a function to use, and it's going to call it whenever it needs to. If we call it beforehand, then we're just giving it, we're not giving it a function. We're giving it just a return value, which, integer or whatever that happens to be. So now that we know the difference between passing a reference to a function and passing a called function or a return value, how could we, instead of using this lambda, use this?
E equals find length x.
Find len like this?
You'll probably still need it to be a string, right?
So what does key have to be? What kind of thing does key have to be?
Be a reference of some sort
Yes. Reference to,
to the original function. So we need to figure out a way to make the original function some kind of reference rather than a return value.
okay.
Right?
So with the lambda, we have the lambda and we can assign it. So this is a function. So x is a function. It's not a called function. It's not a return value. It is a function. We need to pass key a function. So what is find len when you call it? Is it a function?
No,
No.
it's a value, right?
Correct.
Could you just take the return out of the function above?
If you take this out,
Just the return, not the actual.
so you have to use a return statement for normal functions. So
Okay.
so let me break this down a little bit more. If find len when you call it returns the return value, what is find len when you don't call it?
Just the function.
So delete the parentheses and the X.
So find len when you don't call it is a function, right? So I can print this out. What happens if I do print type, oops. So functions are objects, they're things, just like anything else, and you can pass them around. So you don't have to just call a function, you can give a function to something else. And this is exactly what higher order functions do, right? When you call map, you don't call the function, you give map a function and map will call it. Map will call it when and how it needs to call it. You just have to give it a function, right? So that's what we're doing here. This key needs to be a function. Okay, any questions about that?
Would you always use the word key, or can you just kind of put anything there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are two kinds of parameters that you can have for a function. There's basically named parameters and then ordered parameters. So if I write a function, let me go back over here. So if I write a function, I could do A, B, whoops, comma, B, comma, C. Now, if I want to call this, I can do let's do print 1, 2, 3, right? So I can pass these parameters in by order. So I can do 1. So whatever the first one is going to get assigned to A. Whatever the second one is to B. Whatever the third one is to C. You can also be specific and say A equals 1. And you can even do C equals whatever and B equals. So you can pass them in basically as key value pairs. So you can say, I want the A parameter to be this one, and I want the C parameter to be this one. So the order doesn't matter for the second one. So the conclusion you can draw from something like this is that the sorted method has a parameter called key. So you can't just make up whatever you want here. Like this built-in method is expecting a parameter called key. So key equals your function, it can be called whatever you want, but this is not up to you.
That makes sense.
Okay. So we're gonna do now, I'm gonna put you guys back in your groups. Let me stop sharing. All right, so I'm gonna put you guys back in your groups and for another 15 minutes or so. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna try and rewrite that. You're gonna try and rewrite it without using list comprehensions. So you're gonna go back to your group and you're gonna try and take it apart, understand everything that's happening, and then refactor it, rewrite it to not use list comprehensions.
I guess none of us have like a final solution to it yet.
That's fine.
Yeah, we didn't get too far.
You guys can just talk through what you got and what your approach was.
So we understand, well, I guess I understand the sorted part. I don't understand the list comprehension part. And I think Harry may have figured out the list comprehension at the end. He was explaining his solution for that to us. And then once he got the list comprehension, we were just gonna throw the sorted on after.
Okay. So can you talk to me about the list comprehension?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. You can, yeah, so, because I'm trying to figure out what is like, so essentially we're getting an outer list, and within that list, we're putting a range of 5 numbers.
Mhm.
And then each of this number is generated randomly from 1 to 20, right?
Yep.
So that I understand what's going on, and it's just like, it's easier for me to understand it this way than the other way around, where everything is piled together in just one line. That
Yep.
I get so thrown off by that because I don't understand what's happening. But then this is like, okay, let me take a few step backs and kind of like see what's going on.
Yeah.
But then the random, using the lambda as the key and the sorted part of it, I don't understand what is that doing. But I think Tyler was able to explain to me that instead of like essentially, if you have singles, doubles, hundreds, thousands, it's just gonna like sort it that way. So the more the length of the number,
Mhm.
that it's just gonna sort it that way. So I didn't get to that part. I just get like, how can I make this box that puts everything in this order? And this is the way I think it works.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I think that's a yeah, I think that's a very good way. I think this is probably clearer and easier to read than the original one. So good. Yeah, I think you've got the basic mechanics, just the last part is the sorted. So good. How about the Noel, Raimundo, Christopher, and Jesus?
We got something, but I just realized it's sorting it by the value of the number and not the length of the string. But it was just
That's
it
fine.
was order. So yeah, we had like the same thing as Harry, but then we just put array equals sorted array at the bottom. And it sorted the array from lowest to highest. And then I just realized it's going, it just happens to be 1 digit and 2 digit.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So when you call sorted and you don't give it a key, what does it do?
I think it just sorts it from lowest to highest.
Yeah. So if you pass it an integer, it's just going to sort it from lowest. So it's got some default sorting behavior. So what is the point of the key?
To tell it how to sort.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to override the default sorting behavior,
You, uh,
then you give it a key, and that key is a function.
yeah.
Default's probably based on like the ASCII value or something like that. Like lowercase would be higher than uppercase and that sort of thing, or however that works.
Yeah, I'm off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, probably something like that. Yeah.
I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So you can do so. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that right now. But so can you guys how did you figure out, would you mind sharing your screen again?
Oh, yeah.
So where oh, you guys don't have the original problem. Do you have the original up there?
No. No, I don't.
Okay, that's cool. Well, I'll move on to the next group real quick. So Damon and Kenneth and Joyce.
Hey, you're muted, Ken, I think.
Pretty similar to what everyone else had. We started with a for loop, range of 3, and then we had a nested loop inside of it, range of 5, and then we basically appended a random integer between 1 through 20 into this nested list, and then once we got 5 numbers in there, we appended just sorted by the length to the main list, and then we got the final product right there.
Okay, cool. So how did you guys so I see that there's a little bit of formatting. So the original question mark thing. You kind of reformatted a little bit. So why did you do that?
Are you saying like we didn't build it exactly how this comprehension?
I'm saying that I gave it to you as 1 line and now it's 4 lines.
Oh, I think that might just be my replit just being weird. I think this is just how when I forked it, it just came in there that way.
Okay. So you didn't do that on purpose then?
No.
Okay. All right, cool. So I'm gonna show you kind of how I would go about trying to solve something like this. So the first thing I would do is try to increase the readability. So the original problem, let me see if I can find it now. So the original problem is just one. I'll make this a little smaller. Can you guys still read this? Okay. So this is just kind of, obviously very inconvenient to read visually. Like, I don't know how many characters long this is, but, visually, I can't really keep track of everything that's happening here. So the first thing I would do is try to make this visually more so without even changing anything here, try and make this, break it up visually so that you can consume it in reasonable chunks. So this is one way of doing it. It's not the only way, but I can start to see that there are different units here. So there's this outer array, and then I'm sorting something, and then based on that, I could even do this to make this even clearer. So I'm gonna create an array based on something that's sorted, and that thing is going to come from this. So one question you might ask is variable. Is this a good variable name?
No.
Probably not. You can get away with things like X, but I would say almost always a good idea to give it something like a meaningful name. So let's start with this lambda. So what's a good name for X? What would be a better name than X?
Random, maybe.
Okay. Random.
Random int.
Yeah, something like that. So oops. So now when I look at this, I can at least make some sense of this. So it's a function that takes a random int and returns, you take the random int, turn it into a string, and then return the length of that. So that now is like somewhat meaningful to me. I have an idea of what this does. Whereas with the X, it's just like, it's a lot harder to make sense of that. Okay, so what about this X? So what is this X supposed to be?
Is that like your list of lists?
Okay. So breaking that, so maybe let's put this the name of this aside for just a second, and we'll kind of continue down. So I know I'm going to get some kind of sorted thing here, a list of sorted things. And then that list of sorted things is going to come from this. So the question that I have is like, what is the first thing that is going to happen here? So in this whole big mess, what is the first thing that is going to happen?
A random number will be generated into an array.
Yeah, so maybe counterintuitively, the first thing that happens is kind of in the middle, right? So if I have a function, and I pass it a parameter, and I try to call f, what's going to happen? Whoops. It's going to raise an exception. What if instead of passing it, a primitive type, what if I do something like print? Great. What's going to happen when I call f?
Is it not gonna let you call it because it a type error?
Okay, good thought. So what do people think? Is it gonna do the same thing? It's just gonna raise an exception?
It seems like it would, because that's the only thing in the function.
Right? What's gonna happen with this?
It should just do the same thing no matter what you pass into it.
Okay, so let's see what happens.
So raise an exception and print it through?
Well, what's the order? What's the order of events?
So it printed the 3 first, then raise the exception.
Yes. So it has to evaluate this first. So even though, from, in English we read from left to right. So even though the, calling f is the first thing that happens in that left to right schema, what's actually the first thing that happens is this thing right here. The thing in the middle is the thing that happens first. And you could even take this another step further. So now what's the output that I would expect from this?
Inner would be first
Okay.
for the output, and then print inner.
Okay, so inner is going to get printed first, and then something else is going to get printed, right? So what is going to get printed?
Would it be inner again?
What do people think?
Would it be the whole phrase print inner?
Yeah, I've never actually done that where I have a print inside of a print, so I really don't know.
Okay.
Print that.
It won't work. It will print nothing.
Okay, so we got a few different
Oh.
ideas. Let me go ahead and run it, and we'll see what happens. So it prints inner first. So that we understand. It prints inner first. The second thing that it prints is none. So no one thought that it would print none. So why does it print none?
Can it not print a function?
what is happening when you call this? What happens when you call a function?
Returns it, well, this one is returning the string, right?
Close. It's returning something. What does every function do when you call it?
Oh, it has
Return.
returned.
What's that?
Return
ahead,
the
Joe.
value.
Yes, every function when you call it returns a value. What does this function call return?
The value inner, which is a string.
Okay, so we can test that theory. So I'm gonna comment this out. So what is this going to be? What is this line going to print out?
None.
None. So why do you think it's going to print out none?
Because it's the same thing as what you just had above.
But okay, but why? Why would this print out none?
You're basically printing or calling a function inside of a function, but you're not passing it a valid parameter.
Okay, so you think that the none is some kind of like error? It's an indicator that there's an error or something's wrong.
Is it because like the first print it sends the value enter to the terminal, but in the line of code it doesn't actually assign that value to X or anything. So there's just no value there at that point.
Okay. I think we're getting you're in the right ballpark there. So I'm gonna execute this. And when I just execute these two lines, the first one prints inner. And then the second line prints none. So what does this call to print return?
It returns a value that's inner.
It doesn't do that. So what is X?
X is none because it didn't return anything.
X is none because the call to print returns none.
Because print is a function, and it's so hard for me to understand.
So I'm calling print, and what print does is it prints out something to the console. So that's why we're seeing this. And then every function has to return something. And print returns none because it's not really a useful value. Its job is to just print, but every function has to return something, so it returns none. So X is whatever the return value of this is. So X is none. And this line is just printing none. So that's why this is happening. So we're calling print, which has a side effect. It prints out something to the console, but it returns none. And so when you we're assigning X to the return value of print, which is none. So then when we print that value, we're just printing none. So we go back to this, and I run this. We have inner, none, and then this exception. So someone walk me through what's happening here. All right, let me call on someone. Jesus, walk me through what's happening here.
All right, so what's happening there? The computer's reading the print, right? Or the console reading print. It's like, oh, there's a print within the print. Let me print out that first print.
Okay.
And then once it prints out that first print, it'll be like, okay, there's no print after that, and then it'll raise an exception afterwards.
Okay, so this one is going to get executed first, right?
Exactly.
And it's going to have a side effect, which is printing the word inner to the console.
Mhm.
And then what does this return?
That right there will return none because it's nothing really to be declared, nothing really to be declared right there or bring out.
Okay, so this inner expression gets evaluated, right?
Mhm.
It executes, it gets evaluated. So now we have a single value. So once we have a single value, we can now move on to this next one. So print, this next print is going to be called, and we can just substitute the return value. In this case, none. Whoops. So then we call this, and we're going to print none. And then what does this evaluate to? What does this return?
Whatever that returns none.
Yeah, so we can substitute that, none. Now, finally, we can actually call this function, right? So once we have a value to pass in, we can call this function. But we can't do that immediately because before we had all these print statements. So we had to take care of all these other print statements first. These other functions that had to be called and evaluated and so on. Now we can go here, and then when we call f with none, it's just going to raise an exception, which is what you see right here. So the order that things happen, this has to be evaluated before this can be evaluated. So you start from the inside and kind of work your way out. So if we go back up here, we basically, this is the starting point. So once this is executed, we now have, let's say, a list. What do we have here? So if I were to just kind of write this out visually, I do 1, 4, 7, 3, 9, whatever. So I have this, and then what am I doing here? I'm going to create another array where 3 times I'm going over this. So I'm going to wrap this in another array and do that 3 times. So once I have this, so this whole block, I can now substitute for this, right? So I can take this out and I can substitute it. So now for x in this, I'm going to sort it. So let's get back to this x question. So what is x now? If I do 4x in blah, what is x?
X is
Yeah.
each array in the nested array. So like basically.
So what would a good name for x be?
Nested array.
It's not itself a nested array. I mean, it's part. It's a list of random integers, right?
Yeah.
So if we did for list of rand ints, if we print this, I would expect to see a list of random integers. So I'm gonna call this, instead of x, which is not very helpful to me, I'm gonna do this. So now I have this list of random integers, and for each one of those lists of random integers, I want to sort them. And I want to sort them based on how many digits they have. So that's kind of how I would break this up. And now I want to be a little bit more explicit. So let's see if I can rewrite this in such a way that it basically makes sense. So the first thing I'm going to need is this. So I'm just going to copy that. This is like a unit that I'm just going to copy. And I'm going to wrap this in a function. So def create list of random ints. This is not really doing anything except it's giving me a nice descriptive name so I know exactly what it does. So if I have the ability to create a list of random ints, now what do I need to do? Well, I need to create 3 of those inside of another list. So I can do 4, I can just copy this. And then I need to create another list. So outer list equals something. And then I can do outer list dot append. And I can call this function now. So when I call this function, it's going to give me one of these guys. So I'm going to get a list of random ints, and I'm going to loop 3 times, and I'm going to append to this. So if I now print outer list, I'm expecting a list of lists. Okay, and that is what I expect. So I get 3 lists.
Chad, I have a question.
Yes, sure.
So why do we use for underscore in range? Does that just the same as like for say I in range, or?
Yes. Yeah, so that's a good question. Does anyone happen to know?
Is it because it's going to be a random integer? We don't know what it's going to be, so you just put like that almost as like a blank.
So yeah, that's in a ballpark. It doesn't really matter that it's a random integer. What matters is that we don't use the value anywhere else. So I could do this for I in range 3, but I'm not using I anywhere. Right? I don't actually care about this. It just so happens, you might care about it, but in this case, we don't actually need it. So that's why the underscore is telling you that there's a variable here, but we're not going to use it. So there's no point in giving it a name.
Thank you.
Is that best practices usually?
It's just a convention, yeah. It signals to whoever's reading your code that you don't care about this. Okay, so we pulled this out first. That's the first thing, and then now we have a list of lists. So we're basically here in the code. So outer list is right here. So now what we have to do is iterate over this list of lists and sort each list. So I'm going to do for inner list in outer list. Now I'm just going to copy this. And I'm going to have to change this. So this is the inner list. Let's see. Okay. So I'm just going to assign this to something. And then what do I have to do? I have to append it. So I have to recreate a new list. So sort list of lists. And I can do sorted list of lists dot append. sorted list. And now if I print this out, I can see that this appears to be sorted. Yeah, this is not like the most robust test, but it looks good. So 6, 5, and then double digits, single, and then double, single, and then double. So, oftentimes your task as a programmer is going to be trying to understand some complicated bit of logic, and just need to, figure out how to break things down into smaller units so you can examine things kind of step by step. Any questions about that? The visual aspect of coding is pretty important. It's easy to overlook or think, oh, that's not really like directly relevant, but how you present something, how you represent something makes a big difference in terms of how you understand it. Okay, any questions?